Hello student, in our previous videos we are we have started our first chapter, that is signal analysis sensors, and in that we have been seen some introductory part, that is some basic concept, and we started our first chapter, and we have seen some characteristics of the sensors. We know that there are two types of the characteristics of the sensor. First one is the static characteristics and second one is the dynamic characteristics. In our previous video we have been seeing about the static characteristics. In static characteristics there are different parameters which help us to describe the performance of the sensors, or we study the performance of the sensor with the help of that characteristics or the parameter. We have been seeing total 13 parameters, that is the total 13 static characteristics. Now the second type is the dynamic characteristics. So we started with the dynamic characteristics in this video, so let's start with the dynamic characteristics. Second type is the dynamic characteristics of the sensors. Dynamic characteristics is defined as the set of criteria defined for the sensors which changes rapidly with the time. It's called dynamic characteristics of the sensor. We know that the static characteristics does not change with the time or does not vary with the time. So name indicate that these are the static characteristics. But in dynamic characteristics, the set of criteria defined for the system or set of parameters which are defined for the particular sensor which changes rapidly with the time. That means there is a variation in that parameter or the set of criteria with the time. So these characteristics of that sensor is known as the dynamic characteristics of sensor. So there are two types of the dynamic characteristics. Generally there are two types. First is the desirable and second one is the undesirable. In desirable there are two parameters. First is the speed of response and second is the fidelity. These are two parameters which are under the desirable dynamic characteristics, and second one is the undesirable dynamic characteristics. In that there are two parameters. First is the dynamic error and second one is the lag. These are the two parameters which under the undesirable dynamic characteristics. Now generally two types, that is the desirable and undesirable. Under that there are again two types for each. So we see one by one. First we see the speed of response, that is the desirable dynamic characteristics. So first is the speed of response. It is defined as the rapidity of the measurement system that respond to the changes in this measuring variable, or it indicates how active and fast the system is. That means if we take particular instrument or particular sensor, and for that sensor we provide a measuring variable, that means input, and after providing input to the sensor, how it respond, how it rapidly respond to that input. So this defined with the help of speed of response. That means the speed of response, in the name indicate that speed of response, that means the how the sensor fastly respond to the measuring variable or the input. This is defined by the speed of response, and which indicate how active and fast the system is. That means from that we can judge sensor is active, how fast. This can be judged with the help of speed of response. If the speed of response is high, then the sensor is good. That means this sensor is able to respond immediate to the input, so that we will get output immediately after some processing. This is the speed of response. Now second parameter is the fidelity. It is defined as the degree to which a measuring instrument is capable of faithfully reproducing the changes in the input without any dynamic error. That means it is a degree to which measuring instrument, that means the sensor, is capable of faithfully reproducing the changes in the input. Now suppose we have to take some particular set of readings for particular sensor. So suppose we consider the temperature sensor. In that we have to measure the temperature. So there is a ability of that sensor, or the degree to which measuring instrument, that is the degree to which that measuring sensor is capable to reproduce the changes in the input, that means the set of input variables. The ability of that sensor to reproduce the set of input variables without any dynamic error, that means without any error. That dynamic errors means we know that the error is a difference between the true value and the measured value. Same like that, the dynamic error is also, it is a difference between the true value and the measured value, but which is the under varying condition. Varying condition means the environmental parameter which vary, or the some conditions vary, so that we will get the error. So this is the dynamic error. Without any dynamic error, the fidelity character is defined as the, or fidelity parameter is defined without any dynamic error. That means the ability of that sensor to reproduce the changes in the input without any dynamic error. This is the fidelity, which is also important property of the sensor. Next characteristic is the dynamic error. The dynamic error, that is the difference between the true value of the measured quantity to the value shown by the measuring instrument under varying condition. It is one type of the error, that is the dynamic error. It is a difference between true value of the measured quantity. True value of the measured quantity means the input, or the input means true value of the measured quantity. Suppose we have to measure temperature, so the particular standard value of the temperature, we have the particular standard value of the temperature, and the after performing experiment we will get some experimental value. So there is a difference, but this difference, this measurement, that means the measurement of that temperature particularly, so is under varying condition. So we measure the value of the temperature under varying condition, and we have the some standard value for that temperature. So there is a difference between these two values, and this difference is known as the dynamic error. This is about the dynamic error. Now the speed of response and the fidelity comes under the desirable characteristics, and the second type is the dynamic characteristic is the undesirable, which is which has again two parameters, that is the dynamic error, and the next one is the lag. So this is the dynamic error. Now next one is the lag. Every system takes at least some time to respond, whatever time it may be, to respond to the changes in the measured variable. That means we know that if we perform experiment, suppose we turn on the instrument, but this instrument does not respond immediately because it takes time to turn on. Suppose we consider the example of our computer or our laptop system. So if we turn on the laptop, there is some time to take, there is some time taken by the laptop to turn on. That means in this laptop, after turn on, there is some process, so it takes some times to respond. So we wait for that time. This time is the lag. That means every system takes at least some time to respond. After turning on this system takes particular time to respond, whatever time it may be. For different instrument it may be different, so respond to the changes in the measured variable. So this is the lag. For example, lag occurs in a temperature measurement by temperature sensor such as a thermocouple or RTD or dial thermometer due to scale formation on a thermowell due to process liquid. Suppose we consider the example of the temperature sensor. Suppose thermocouple or RTD, temperature resistance dependent, resistance temperature dependent, or dial thermometer. In these sensors we measure the temperature, but particular thermometer consists different material. That means suppose we take the example of mercury thermometer. Mercury thermometer has a process liquid which is a mercury. So this liquid takes time for processing, so that the temperature measurement takes some time. That means the temperature goes from low value to high value, it takes some time to go from low value to high value, that is the due to process of liquid. So this is the example of the lags occurs in a temperature measurement due to process liquid on the particular scale. That means there is an increasing scale due to process liquid, and so it takes time, and this is the lag. Generally there are two types of the lags, such as a retardation lag and time delay lag. Two types. Retardation lag means system takes some some retardation means sometimes system get on, but it takes particular process, it follow particular process, that is a retardation. And the time delay means particular device take particular time for that. That means the different devices have different time to turn on the particular device. So these are the two types of the lags, that is the retardation lag and time delay lags. These are the dynamic characteristics of the sensors, that is desirable and undesirable, and under that there are again two parameters each of. So this is all about the sensor characteristics. Now we have discussed the both characteristics, that is static characteristics as well as the dynamic characteristics of the sensor. Now this is all about the characteristics of the sensor. Now next point of our first chapter is the classification of sensors. We know that the sensor is a device which is used to measure the physical quantity and which convert this physical quantity into measurable form, that is the either electrical, that is in the electrical signal, either voltage or current. Now there are different types of the sensors depending on the different criteria. So let's see. First type is the according to power or energy supply requirement of the sensors. There are generally four types. First is the according to the power requirement. That means if we consider the particular sensor which require power, but some sensor does not require any power supply for their operation. So depending on that, there are different types of the sensors. Now second criteria is the according to the various measurement quantities. We know that the sensors are used to measure different physical quantities, and depending on that, that means suppose we consider the physical quantity, that is the temperature, and the sensor which is used to measure the temperature is known as the temperature sensor. So according to that, same like other, there are different types of the sensors. Third criteria is the according to principle of operation. We know that the different sensor has a different operating principle. So depending on that, there are also different types of the sensors. Now next criteria is the according to output signal. We know that there are generally two types of the signal. First is the analog signal and second one is the digital signal. Now according to that, there are different types of the sensors, generally analog sensor and digital sensor. So depending on the output signal. So these are the basic four criteria. On that the sensors are classified into different types. Now let's see. First is the according to power or energy supply requirement of the sensors. So first is the based on the requirement of the power supply. We know that if the device is if the device operate on the external power supply, then depending on that, is operating on the external power supply or not, depending on there are two types, that is active and passive. So this is these are the two types. So first is the active sensor and second one is the passive sensor. Now let's see. First, active sensor. Those sensors that require power supply are called as active sensors. Now active sensor means those sensor which requires external power supply for their operation is known as the active sensor. For example, we consider the LiDAR, that is the light detection and ranging. This sensor is used to detect the light, particular light intensity or light. So this sensor require power supply for their operation. So this is known as the active sensor. Second example is a photoconductive cell. which is shown in the figure, that is a photoconductive cell. It has a two terminal because this device or this cell require external power supply, so these terminal are used for the connection of the external power supply. Next one is the thermocouple also require external power supply, so these all are the active sensor. Now second type is the passive sensor. So those sensors that do not require power supply are called as a passive sensors. That means opposite to that of the active sensors. In active sensor, power supply is necessary, but in passive sensor, they do not require any power supply for their operation. And these sensors are known as the passive sensors. If we take the example of mercury thermometer and the thermistor, the mercury thermometer is shown in the figure. This thermometer we have been generally used in a lab. We generally used in a laboratories, that is in a measurement of a temperature. So this is for that we are familiar for that. So this is a mercury thermometer. The reddish color is the within the thermometer is the mercury, that is the mercury. We know that in mercury thermometer there is the expansion of the mercury which is in the form of liquid, so we will be able to measure the temperature. So this is the passive sensors which does not require any external power supply. You know that if we take the example of that mercury thermometer, this mercury thermometer does not require any external power supply. If we want to measure the temperature, we directly insert on that, so in that, so we are able to measure the temperature of that system. This is all about the active sensor and passive sensor, which are based on the requirement of the external power supply. Now next type is the based on the principle of operation. We know that there are different types of the sensors, and these sensors have different operating principle, and depending on that there are different types of the sensor. So first type is the resistive sensor, second one is the capacitive sensors, and third one is the inductive sensor, and last one is the ultrasonic sensors. These are all four types which are based on the operating principle or the principle of operation of that particular sensors. In resistive sensors there is a change in the resistance. Capacitive, same, the capacitance changes. Inductive, generally inductive sensors are used for the metallic objects, and ultrasonic sensor is used to detect a particular object which is far away from us, such as the ultrasonic sensor have the operation principle same like as a sonar. We know that there are ultrasonic waves are used to detect the objects which are far away from us. These all are the four types of the sensor which are based on the principle of operation. We will see these four types in our next video, not in detail but in brief, so we will get idea about that actually what is the resistive sensor, capacitive sensor, inductive sensor, and the ultrasonic sensor. So we will continue these types in a brief in our next video. So